For months, Jake Miller and his crew taunted, humiliated, and cornered Aaliyah Monroe on that school bus, believing they would always get away with it. They thought her silence was weakness, thought their lies and privilege made them untouchable. Then, one morning, they crossed the line. They tried to force her to the back of the bus, laying their hands on her in a final, hateful gesture of power. But what they didn't know was that Aaliyah Monroe was a state champion wrestler, and she had been holding back far longer than they ever deserved. When they grabbed her, she fought back, and this time, she didn't stop. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The morning carried that cold stillness that always settled over the neighborhood before the day properly woke. Not sharp enough to freeze, but cold enough to sit beneath the skin, persistent in its quiet way. The sky hung low and gray, thick clouds pressing over the streets without promise of sun, casting everything in a pale, tired light. At the corner where Woodmere met Ash, the school bus slowed to its usual stop, its old frame creaking under the weight of routine, the exhaust trailing behind it in a heavy breath. Aaliyah Monroe stood waiting at the curb, shoulders squared beneath her jacket, the strap of her backpack set firm against one side. Her face, steady and unreadable, showed none of the tension she felt beneath the surface. She had grown used to this moment, if not comfortable with it, knowing exactly what waited for her the second she stepped onto that bus. Her eyes scanned the windows briefly, catching the usual faces, faces that never looked away, faces that waited for her like they always did, full of the same tired malice they dragged out every morning as though it gave them life. Jake Mallory sat in his usual place near the front, looking down the aisle as though he owned the space between them. His gaze, sharp and expectant, locked onto her with the same hunger for trouble he carried like a second skin. Trevor and Kyle flanked him as they always did, quick to laugh at whatever Jake found amusing, quick to follow wherever he decided to lead. They watched Aaliyah the way they watched every day, not with curiosity, but with something colder, a need to remind her that this was their bus, their town, their rules, and that her quiet refusal to bend to them was a challenge they could not ignore. The door folded open with a groan, and Aaliyah stepped up without hesitation. The smell of fuel and old sweat filled the cramped space, pressing in from every side, stale from days of teenage bodies and neglect. Mr. Halverson, the bus driver, barely looked at her. His eyes flicked once to the mirror, then drifted back to the road ahead, his face set in that familiar line of tired disinterest. He had seen this all before, and made his choice long ago to pretend it wasn't happening, to let the ugliness play out without stepping into it. Aaliyah climbed the steps at her usual pace, steady, unhurried, her movements calm, not because she felt calm, but because she refused to let them see anything else. She passed the front row, then the next, hearing the rustle of crumpled paper between Trevor's fingers, catching the quiet sound of their snickers before they even spoke a word. She didn't give them her attention. Her focus stayed on her seat, the one she had claimed long ago by the window, not too far back, not too close to the front, a place that let her watch the world beyond the glass and escape, if only in her mind. A wad of paper struck her shoulder just as she slid into place, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to remind her they were watching, always watching. Jake's voice followed close behind, loud enough for the whole bus to hear, sharp with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing he'd drawn blood, even if it wasn't visible. "Careful now, champ," he called out, his words dragging across her like sandpaper. "Wouldn't want to mess up that shiny jacket of yours." Laughter scattered across the bus in quick bursts, students turning just enough to see her reaction, but not enough to get involved. Aaliyah stayed where she was, her eyes fixed on the window, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt the weight of every glance, every smirk thrown in her direction, and she let it settle without rising to meet it. This wasn't new. This was the price of not giving them what they wanted. Mr. Halverson kept his eyes on the road as he shifted the bus back into gear, pulling away from the curb with a heavy lurch. The engine rattled beneath the floor, the tires humming against the pavement as the neighborhood slipped past outside. Aaliyah let her gaze drift over the houses, the bare trees lining the streets, the empty sidewalks that seemed to stretch on without end. Her fingers traced the stitching of her jacket almost absently, feeling the raised letters of her name beneath her touch, a quiet reminder of who she was, no matter how many times they tried to strip it away. Every day, it played out the same way. Every day, they waited for her to react, to snap, to give them permission to turn their cruelty into something louder, something uglier. And every day, she held her ground, not because she couldn't fight back, but because she had chosen to wait, to hold on to her power until the moment it mattered most. They thought they were winning. They thought her silence was surrender. But they never saw the truth beneath the surface. They never understood that Aaliyah Monroe was not avoiding the fight. She was choosing it, on her terms, in her time. The bus carried on down its route, its heavy tires grinding against the uneven pavement as neighborhoods slipped by in a slow parade of sameness. Houses with trimmed lawns and closed blinds, a town that prided itself on appearances but could never quite hide the cracks running beneath the surface. Inside the bus, the morning rhythm resumed its familiar course, conversations rising and falling in scattered pockets, while the steady hum of the engine filled the spaces in between. Yet, beneath that ordinary noise, something sharper pulsed. A tension that belonged solely to Aaliyah, Jake, and the quiet battle they waged without ever needing to name it. Jake shifted in his seat, his posture too relaxed to be natural. One arm draped over the worn vinyl as he watched Aaliyah with that same hollow grin he wore every day, the grin that never reached his eyes. His gaze slid over her jacket, lingered on the bold lettering that marked her as a champion, and narrowed slightly, as if the very sight of her accomplishments scratched at something brittle inside him. "Hey, Kyle," Jake drawled, loud enough to cut across the scattered chatter of the other students. "Think Monroe here remembers how to pin somebody outside of a trophy ceremony?" Kyle, always eager to play his part, gave a short laugh that carried a forced edge, as though he feared falling short of Jake's expectations. "Maybe she needs a refresher," he replied, balling a gum wrapper in his palm before flicking it with careless aim toward the aisle, where it skidded past Aaliyah's seat and landed beneath the bench ahead of her. Trevor, not to be outdone, twisted in his seat to join in, his smirk lazy but his eyes sharp, scanning her face for the smallest flicker of reaction. Aaliyah didn't turn her head. She didn't shift in her seat or let her expression change in any visible way. She kept her gaze on the window, steady and unflinching, her posture straight, her hands resting loose in her lap. Yet beneath that stillness, she felt it all. The weight of their words, the petty missiles they hurled at her day after day, each one piling onto the last in a slow, grinding effort to chip away at the wall she kept between herself and their poison. "Come on, Monroe," Jake pressed, the taunt thick with false encouragement. "Show us a move or two. Bet you could throw Kyle halfway down the aisle. Not that he'd mind." The bus erupted in a burst of laughter, not the kind born from genuine humor, but the brittle, nervous kind that came from people desperate not to be the next target. Even those who felt the wrongness of it all, and there were a few, their faces tight with discomfort, chose silence over risk, burying their unease beneath forced smiles and averted eyes. Mr. Halverson remained at the wheel, his gaze fixed forward, as though the road demanded every ounce of his attention, though it was clear he heard every word. His knuckles tightened slightly on the steering wheel, a small, fleeting sign that he was not entirely deaf to the ugliness unfolding behind him. But the tension passed as quickly as it came, and he said nothing, did nothing, allowing the moment to stretch unchallenged. The bus rattled over a pothole, jostling the students in their seats, and Aaliyah felt the vibration climb through her legs, settling deep in her chest, like a quiet drumbeat echoing beneath her ribs. She thought of her father again, his voice clear in her memory, not fading with time but growing sharper, as though the more she needed it, the closer it stayed. He had always told her that people like Jake thrived on reactions, that their power was borrowed from the fear they could provoke in others, and she had carried those words like armor, letting them harden her resolve day after day. Still, there were limits to even the strongest defenses, and Aaliyah could feel the slow erosion as surely as she felt the cold against her skin each morning. She wondered, not for the first time, how long this could continue before something inside her snapped. Not with regret, but with inevitability. Jake wasn't finished. He never was. Emboldened by her silence, he reached down to his backpack, unzipped it with slow, deliberate care, and pulled free a crumpled page torn from a magazine. He held it up so the others could see. An article about the state wrestling championships, the headline bold beneath Aaliyah's victorious photo. Her face stared back from the page, confident and proud, a stark contrast to the mockery unfolding around her. "Hey, look at this!" Jake called out, shaking the paper for emphasis. "Our very own celebrity. Think she signs autographs?" He tore the page in half with a sharp rip, then quarters, then smaller still, letting the shredded pieces fall to the floor like discarded confetti. Guess not. The pieces fluttered down between the seats, settling among the dust and debris already littering the aisle, and Aaliyah felt something tighten low in her chest, not a spark of fury, but something colder and heavier, a quiet coiling of patience stretched thin across too many days of quiet endurance. She said nothing, not because she lacked the words, but because she knew they weren't worth spending on him. Her silence wasn't weakness, it wasn't surrender, it was choice, and every day she held to it, she chose not to waste herself on people too small to understand the measure of their own cruelty. The bus carried on its path, grinding along the same worn streets it had crossed 1,000 times before, but inside, the tension pressed down heavier than the air outside, settling over the rows of seats until every breath felt just a little tighter. The ordinary sounds of the engine and the scattered conversations drifted in the background, yet beneath it all there was a pulse, steady and sharp, thrumming through the space between Aaliyah and those who had made her their target for yet another morning. She could feel it gathering strength, not in sudden bursts, but in the slow, grinding way storms build over open plains, inevitable and unstoppable once set in motion. Jake lounged in his seat with a deliberate kind of ease, his posture loose but his eyes sharp, fixed on her like he had nothing else in the world worth his attention. There was no mistaking the hunger in his gaze, the way he sought not just to provoke her, but to pull her down into the mud where he had already resigned himself to live. She saw it as clearly as she saw the dirt-streaked floor beneath her feet, and though she kept her gaze turned to the window, she made no effort to pretend she didn't feel his attention crawling across her skin. "Hey, Monroe!" Jake's voice rang out again, loud enough to claim the attention of the bus with practiced ease, his words carrying that familiar sneer, though beneath it there was a growing edge of something rawer, more insistent. "What's the matter with you? Starting to think you forgot how to speak." He let the insult hang, his smirk deepening as Trevor and Kyle leaned in closer, eager to catch every word. Aaliyah, without turning her head, let her voice rise just enough to reach them, smooth and steady, carrying not the heat of anger, but the cool weight of someone who had chosen every word with care. "I speak when there's something worth saying," she replied, her tone quiet but firm, as though she were stating a simple fact, rather than offering a retort. The unexpected answer silenced the row of boys for a beat longer than they intended, a flicker of uncertainty crossing Jake's face before he covered it with a scoff and leaned back in his seat as if her words had been no more than wind against his window. But Aaliyah saw it, saw the moment where the balance had shifted, just slightly, just enough to remind him that she wasn't carved from the fear he wanted to see in her. Trevor, eager to claw back their momentum, forced a laugh and nudged Kyle hard in the ribs, drawing attention back to their side of the exchange. "Guess that means you got nothing, huh?" Trevor threw in, his grin wide, though his eyes darted to Jake for approval before settling back on Aaliyah. She let a breath move slowly through her chest, steadying herself against the weight of the moment, then answered in the same calm tone, never raising her voice, never giving them the fire they craved. "I've got plenty," she said, her gaze still fixed on the blur of houses sliding past outside the window. "But none of it belongs to you." Her words, simple as they were, carried more weight than any shout could have, and though the laughter that followed tried to brush them aside, there was no mistaking the way Jake's expression had tightened at the corners, the way his fingers flexed against the edge of his seat, as if itching to find a better weapon than words. Not satisfied with what little ground he had gained, Jake reached for the battered water bottle at his feet, lifting it as if he held something more than trash in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it skidding across the aisle, aiming low so it bumped against Aaliyah's bag before coming to rest beneath her seat. "Since you're feeling generous," he said, voice dripping with mockery, "thought you could do something useful." A few snickers echoed around the bus, but they felt thinner now, less certain, as if the other students sensed that the air between Aaliyah and Jake had shifted, that beneath her quiet control, something was gathering strength, waiting for the moment to rise. Aaliyah glanced down at the bottle, then lifted her eyes once more to the window, letting a pause stretch between them, not hurried, not forced. When she spoke, her voice remained cool, edged with steel beneath the calm. "Pick it up yourself," she said, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the murmur of the bus and reach Jake where he sat. The words settled heavily in the space between them, and though Jake's smirk never faltered on the surface, his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, a tension creeping into his shoulders that had not been there before. He masked it with a laugh, sharp and brittle, waving off the moment as though it were nothing, but Aaliyah saw the truth behind his eyes. "You're too good for that, too, huh?" he snapped, his voice rising slightly, betraying the crack in his composure. Aaliyah didn't bother to answer this time. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was a wall, a fortress he had not yet breached, and every taunt that failed to shake her only made that wall stronger. Outside, the bus slowed as it neared the next stop, the engine rumbling beneath their feet, and Aaliyah felt the moment folding into itself, not ending, but waiting, gathering its weight for what was still to come. She held her ground, steady as ever, knowing the line they were towing had not been crossed yet. But it would be. It always would be, because boys like Jake never knew when to stop. And when that moment arrived, she would be ready. The bus dragged itself along the uneven road, tires rumbling beneath the floor, as though the very machine itself felt the strain of the tension rising inside its narrow walls. The noise of the engine faded beneath the louder pulse of something far heavier, something alive in the air, twisting between the seats and filling the lungs of every student too afraid to speak, too curious to look away. They all felt it, even if they pretended not to, the inevitable clash creeping closer with every mile, every breath, every glance thrown toward the front of the bus where Aaliyah sat. Jake's posture shifted, no longer relaxed, but hunched forward, his elbows digging into his knees as his eyes fixed on her with a hunger sharpened by frustration, by weeks of being ignored, by the bitter taste of power slipping from his fingers day after day. His voice cut across the low murmur of the bus like a blade, cold and ugly, meant for every ear in the vehicle. "Girl like you should know better than to sit up front," he sneered, each word heavy with venom, no longer hidden beneath the thin veil of jokes. "You don't belong here." Aaliyah turned her head slowly, her gaze steady, her face calm but unyielding as she locked eyes with him. Her voice rose, low but clear, as if she weighed every word before she let it leave her lips. "The only thing I don't belong to is you," she answered, her tone as even as stone, refusing to give him the fire he so desperately sought. Jake's lips pulled into a sharp, mocking grin, but his eyes betrayed him, flashing with something closer to fury. Big words, Monroe. You think because you can toss some skinny girls around on a mat, you can act like you're better than the rest of us? His voice climbed louder, sharper, and he made no effort to mask the bitterness creeping through. You think your little gold medal means you're one of us? Trevor, emboldened by Jake's rising anger, jumped in eagerly, his grin wide and cruel. Nah, she thinks she's better than us, he spat, his eyes sweeping over Aaliyah like she was something less than human. She thinks a few medals and a state title make her more than just another hood rat getting lucky. The words hit the air like a slap, sharp enough to draw a few gasps from the more cautious students on the bus, but none loud enough to challenge the storm Jake and his boys had stirred to life. Aaliyah's fingers curled against the fabric of her pants, but she forced her voice to remain level, forcing every word to pass through the steady beat of her pulse. Say whatever you need to feel tall, Trevor, she replied, her gaze never breaking away from Jake. You'll still come up small. Laughter from the boys broke out, harsh and forced, as if they could laugh loud enough to drown the heat rising beneath their skin. Kyle, desperate not to be left behind, jabbed his elbow at Trevor and added, She talks tough, but all she's good for is warming a seat in the back like she's supposed to. Jake's grin widened, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. That's right, Monroe. You think you're better? Prove it. He spread his arms wide, gesturing down the length of the bus. Because from where I'm sitting, you're just another loudmouthed ghetto princess pretending she belongs. Aaliyah's breath slowed, her pulse steadying even as the weight of their words pressed harder against her chest. She rose, slowly, deliberately, her shoulders squaring as she met Jake's stare without hesitation. I belong wherever I choose to stand, she said, her voice firm enough to quiet the noise for one brief, charged moment. Trevor snorted, but there was unease beneath the sound. Then stand at the back, he shot back, his voice tighter than before, his bravado stretched thin. You gonna move her, Trevor? Aaliyah asked, her tone sharp but even, challenging without raising her voice, her eyes narrowing slightly as she held his gaze. Or you just gonna run your mouth all day? The challenge stung, and Trevor's pride flared like a struck match. He pushed into the aisle, his chest puffed out as he threw his shoulders forward. I'll do more than move you, he snapped, reaching toward the strap of her backpack with greedy fingers. I'll put you back in your place. The moment his hand closed on her strap, time seemed to tighten its grip on the scene, holding it in suspension for a heartbeat before the storm finally broke. Aaliyah's voice came sharp and cutting. Take your hand off me. But Trevor, too caught in the momentum of the moment, pulled harder. Or what? He taunted, though the quiver beneath his words betrayed the flicker of doubt already growing in him. Aaliyah moved without hesitation, her hand snapping up to seize his wrist, her grip strong enough to freeze him in place, the confidence draining from his face as he struggled to pull away. Or you'll find out exactly what I've been holding back, she answered, her tone cold and certain, her eyes locked onto his with a force that left no room for bluff. Kyle, watching the exchange, shoved forward, trying to grab her other arm, but Aaliyah was faster. She twisted Trevor's wrist, stepping into his space as she guided him sideways, using his own weight against him with practiced ease. He stumbled, losing his footing, and with a sharp shift of her hips, she sent him sprawling into the seat behind him, his body crashing against the metal with a loud, humiliating thud. Kyle's reach barely brushed her sleeve before she caught him as well, her fingers wrapping around his forearm and turning his momentum against him. You really think numbers change the outcome? She threw at him, her voice rising now, not in panic, but in controlled fire. With a sharp movement, she unbalanced him, sweeping his legs from beneath him so that he landed hard beside Trevor, breathless and dazed, their bravado flattened in an instant beneath the weight of her skill. Gasps rippled through the bus. The silent witnesses forced to reckon with a truth they could no longer deny, and Jake, caught between fury and fear, barked out a hollow command. "Get her, Trevor! Don't just sit there!" Trevor struggled to rise, his hands fumbling against the seat. But his courage, so loud moments before, had drained from his face, replaced by the wide-eyed realization of a fight already lost. Aaliyah turned her gaze fully to Jake now, her stance rooted, unmovable, her presence filling the space between them. "Come get me yourself," she said, her voice echoing through the stunned silence of the bus. "If you've got the guts." Jake's mouth opened, but no words came. The balance had shifted, and they all knew it. For a long, breathless moment, the entire bus seemed to fall into a stunned stillness, as if the sheer weight of what had just unfolded had pressed down upon every student, every inch of space, trapping them in a frozen frame of disbelief. Trevor, still splayed across the seat like a discarded rag doll, let out a sharp, wheezing breath, his chest rising and falling with quick, panicked jolts, while Kyle scrambled to push himself upright, his eyes wide and wild, as though he had awoken into a nightmare of his own making and found no way out. Jake's mouth worked uselessly. The words he had so confidently wielded just moments before caught somewhere between his throat and tongue, strangled by the sight of Aaliyah standing before him, her posture unbroken, her gaze locked on him with a calm so fierce it made the space between them feel razor-thin. His pride clung to the scraps of command, but it hung limp in his chest, stripped of its power, reduced to trembling anger. "You're dead for this," Jake snapped, but his voice cracked beneath the weight of his fear, exposing the raw panic he could no longer hide. Aaliyah's reply came smooth as ever, her eyes cold and steady, her words sliding into the space like iron through silk. "You've been dead since you thought you could lay a hand on me." Kyle, breathing hard, sprang up with a ragged snarl, driven less by courage and more by the sharp sting of humiliation clawing through him. "I'm not done with you," he barked, his arms swinging wild, desperation in every movement. He lunged for her, but Aaliyah stepped into him with precision, her body a blur of practiced force. She caught his forearm mid-swing, twisted it sharply, and drove her knee into his gut with perfect timing, folding him over with a harsh grunt that sucked the breath from his lungs. "You don't get to decide when it ends," she told him coldly, before letting him drop, gasping, back into the seat. Trevor, pulling himself upright and red-faced with fury, roared from behind, reckless in his panic. "She thinks she's some kind of queen," he shouted, his voice hoarse, as he charged at her, arms wide like he believed sheer size could compensate for his lack of skill. "Knock her down!" But Aaliyah met him without hesitation, her body turning as she sidestepped his clumsy rush, letting his own momentum carry him past. She seized his shoulder, dragging him back toward her with a twist, and as he stumbled, she drove an elbow across his chest, sharp and clean, sending him sprawling into the narrow aisle, his back crashing against the edge of a seat with a thud that silenced the air for half a heartbeat. "You'll need more than weight to move me," Aaliyah answered, not raising her voice, yet her words cut deeper than any shout could have managed. Jake's face twisted in rage, his mask of control slipping entirely as he pushed out of his seat. "Get her! Both of you!" he screamed, voice rising with a shrill edge that peeled away whatever thin layer of authority he still believed he held. "She's just a stupid, dirty thug." Trevor scrambled up, blood in his mouth, wiping it away with the back of his hand as he forced a snarl through his pain. "You don't belong here," he spat, voice trembling with fury. "Go back to the streets where you came from." Aaliyah's eyes never wavered. She answered with action, not wasted breath. As Trevor rushed her again, she pivoted smoothly, using his reckless energy against him, throwing him with a practiced hip toss that landed him flat on his back. The wind knocked clean from his chest. Kyle, desperate to reclaim some shred of dominance, lunged once more, teeth gritted, but she intercepted him with flawless precision, catching him mid-stride, locking his arm beneath her own, and with a sharp twist, she sent him crashing headfirst into Trevor as he struggled to rise, both boys collapsing in a heap of tangled limbs and defeat. Gasps filled the air, a mixture of disbelief and fear rippling through the other students, and Jake, watching his boys flattened before him, seemed to shrink into himself, his bluster evaporating into something smaller, something pathetic beneath Aaliyah's quiet, unstoppable force. "You think this is over?" Jake hissed, though his voice cracked beneath the weight of terror. Aaliyah stepped toward him, not rushed, not violent, but with the certainty of someone who had never been unsure of her power. "I know it is," she replied, her voice low and final, "and you do too." But before Jake could summon another weak insult, before he could conjure even a fragment of the false courage he had worn like armor, the sharp, panicked bark of Mr. Halvorson's voice tore through the bus at last, his delayed authority finally arriving like an afterthought to the storm. "Enough!" the driver shouted, his voice hoarse and unsteady, hands trembling on the wheel as he yanked the bus to a hard, jarring stop at the side of the road. "That's enough!" The squeal of brakes filled the tight space, jolting the students as the bus rocked beneath them. Mr. Halvorson shoved himself out of his seat, his tall frame clumsy with panic, eyes darting wildly between the battered boys and the calm, towering figure of Aaliyah. "What the hell is going on back here?" he demanded, though the answer hung heavy in the air, obvious to all who had witnessed every moment, every insult, every shove and taunt that had led to this inevitable collapse. Jake, seizing the opening like the coward he had proven himself to be, stabbed a trembling finger toward Aaliyah, his voice breaking as he shouted, "She attacked us! She went crazy!" Trevor, still wheezing for breath, forced himself to echo the lie. "Yeah," she snapped. "Mr. Halvorson, we didn't even touch her." Aaliyah's gaze never left Jake as she answered, her voice steady, grounded, and unshaken. "They touched me first. They always do." The words settled like stone across the silence, and though the driver looked between them with uncertainty flickering in his eyes, he said nothing more, turning back to the wheel with a muttered, "Principal will deal with this." As the bus lurched back into motion, the students sat frozen in place, the quiet thrum of the engine now a hollow echo beneath the weight of what had transpired. Aaliyah, calm and composed, returned to her seat as if reclaiming a throne no one could dare to contest. But deep within the charged silence of that bus, everyone knew this fight was not finished. It had only just begun. The bus doors hissed open with a shuddering breath as they pulled into the school lot. But no one moved. Not at first. The students sat stiff in their seats, as though some invisible weight pinned them there, the tension from the ride still hanging over them like a fog that refused to lift. Conversations that might have sparked the moment the bus came to a halt never found their voices. Instead, eyes flicked sideways, hesitant, uncertain, darting between Aaliyah and the defeated heap of Jake's crew, as though no one dared to speak aloud what they had just witnessed. Jake, nursing his bruised pride far more than any injury to his body, broke the silence first. He shot to his feet with forced energy, his chest heaving as he pulled together the frayed strands of his bravado, weaving them into a pitiful mask of righteousness. "Come on!" he barked to Trevor and Kyle, who dragged themselves upright with visible effort, their faces pale, their movements stiff and pained. "Principal needs to hear about this right now." Trevor grunted his agreement, but his voice lacked conviction. "She blindsided us," he said, more to the watching students than to Jake himself, as if rehearsing the lie before it had the chance to rot in his throat. "We were just trying to calm her down." Kyle limped behind them, his eyes hard and bitter. "Crazy girl snapped out of nowhere," he added, playing his part, though his gaze avoided Aaliyah altogether, too aware of the truth to meet her eyes directly. Aaliyah remained seated, her body still and composed, her breath slow and even as she watched them scramble to shape the story into something that might save them. She could feel the eyes of her peers lingering on her, wavering between doubt and silent admiration, caught in the conflict of what they had seen and what they were afraid to admit. Their uncertainty settled over the moment like a film of dust, dulling the edges of the truth, even as it lay in plain sight. Mr. Halverson climbed down from the driver's seat and stepped into the aisle, his face tight with the strain of what he had witnessed, but lacked the courage to confront properly. His eyes flitted toward Aaliyah, holding there for a fraction of a second longer than they should have, as if debating some unspoken apology, but he said nothing, offered no explanation, no acknowledgement of the role his silence had played in letting the situation spiral. "You're coming with me," he said finally, his voice clipped and uncomfortable as he gestured toward Aaliyah. "Principal wants to see you, too." The murmurs grew as Aaliyah stood, and though she carried no fear in her posture, she felt the heat of the moment tightening around her ribs, heavy and unwelcome. She stepped off the bus without hesitation, her gaze steady and unyielding, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their false narrative. Inside the front office, the chill of sterile air conditioning pressed against her skin as she took her seat across from Principal Thompson's wide, cluttered desk. Mrs. Thompson, a woman whose polished appearance masked the thin edge of anxiety twitching beneath her surface, folded her hands tightly atop a stack of disciplinary reports. Her mouth pressed into a line so narrow it looked as though it had been drawn with a blade. Jake sat slouched in a chair beside the principal, his lips swollen, a faint mark blooming beneath his left eye, but his voice remained loud, righteous, desperate to drown out the truth beneath a flood of accusation. "She lost it, Mrs. Thompson," he insisted, his words fast and frantic. "We were just minding our own business, and she snapped, started swinging before we could even say a word." Trevor jumped in without missing a beat, his tone practiced, his face a mask of mock outrage. "She's dangerous," he pressed, jabbing a finger toward Aaliyah as though distance alone might keep him safe from her. "She needs to be expelled before she hurts someone else." Kyle, clutching his wrist for dramatic effect, gave a quick, shaky nod. "She went wild, Principal Thompson. We were trying to calm her down and she just—" "Enough," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice quiet but sharp, cutting clean through their performance like a blade through paper. "You think if you say it loud enough, they'll believe you," she said, her gaze unwavering as she met Mrs. Thompson's eyes across the desk. "But the truth doesn't change just because you're afraid of it." Principal Thompson cleared her throat, her discomfort settling visibly across her expression as she shifted in her seat. "Miss Monroe," she began, her tone strained, leaning into the careful neutrality of someone who feared public fallout more than justice itself. "There are serious allegations being made against you. I need to understand exactly what happened on that bus this morning." Aaliyah's reply came without hesitation. "What happened," she said, her voice smooth and level, "is that they thought they could humiliate me again, just like they've been doing every day. And this time, they tried to put their hands on me. I defended myself. That's all there is." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered toward the boys, and though doubt clouded her gaze for a fleeting moment, she quickly buried it beneath a mask of administrative procedure. "Until we conduct a full investigation," she said, her voice slipping into the practiced cadence of bureaucracy, "you will be placed on temporary suspension, effective immediately." The words settled over the room like ash, soft but suffocating, and though Aaliyah had expected them, they still burned against her chest, not from surprise, but from the bitter familiarity of injustice that had always found its way into places like this. Jake's smirk reappeared, thin and vindictive. "Told you," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, and for the principal to pretend she hadn't. But Aaliyah did not flinch. She rose from her chair with quiet strength, her voice steady as she spoke. "This isn't over." And though Mrs. Thompson said nothing, and though the boys drowned themselves in their hollow victory, Somewhere in the back of the office, beneath the weight of her words, something had already begun to crack. The cold spring wind met Aaliyah the moment she stepped outside the building, the sharp edge of it sliding against her skin. Not brutal, but insistent, as if the air itself sought to remind her of the weight she now carried across her shoulders. The parking lot stretched out in quiet emptiness, the sky above gray and unmoved by the storm brewing beneath it. And somewhere in the distance, the shrill clang of the school bell marked the end of a class period, the sound far too ordinary for a day that had already split itself into before and after. Her steps across the asphalt were steady, measured against the heaviness lodged deep in her chest, each one carrying the ache of knowing that they had twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. And they had done it without shame, without hesitation, as if lies were the only language they knew how to speak. She could still see their faces clearly in her mind. Jake's trembling mask of arrogance, Trevor's desperate nods, Kyle's cowardly silence, all of them clinging to their performance like drowning men to driftwood, hoping it would carry them to safe shores, while she was left to sink beneath the weight of their accusations. Behind her, the glass doors of the administrative office caught her reflection, bending it into warped angles, as if the building itself sought to erase her from its memory, to smooth over the moment as though it had never existed. But Aaliyah knew better. She would remember every breath of that conversation, every dismissive glance, every rehearsed lie that had rolled from their tongues so easily it made her stomach turn. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, sharp against the stillness of her thoughts, and she pulled it free to see her brother's name lighting the screen. Without a moment of hesitation she answered, lifting the phone to her ear as her eyes scanned the empty stretch of the lot. His voice came fast, taut with urgency, already filled with the storm of someone who knew, without needing to be told, that something was wrong. "What happened?" "They suspended me," she said, her words steady despite the sour taste they left behind. "Claimed they need time to investigate, but they've already made up their minds." There was a long, sharp breath on the other end of the line, the kind of exhale that dragged frustration behind it, like a chain. "They suspended you?" he repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it any less outrageous. "Tell me everything, start to finish. Don't leave out a thing." So she did, not rushing through the details, not sparing herself the weight of reliving the moments that still burned hot beneath her ribs. She told him about the taunts, the slurs, the way they had shoved her and sneered when they thought they had won, the way they had twisted their fear into accusations the moment the tables turned. She spoke of Mrs. Thompson's thinly veiled discomfort, of her hollow promises of fairness, of the way the words temporary suspension had landed like a hammer between her ribs. Her brother listened without interrupting, but she could hear the tension growing in his silence, could feel the way each word fed the fire simmering just beneath the surface. When she finished, there was a beat of stillness before his voice came low and tight, sharp enough to cut steel. "They think they can get away with this," he said, no doubt in his tone, only raw certainty. "They think if they spin their lies fast enough, no one will bother to check what's true. They're protecting themselves," Aaliyah replied, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the school grounds, her mind already moving ahead to the next battle waiting just out of sight. "The truth is a threat to them. You're not alone in this," he said, his voice grounding her, steady and fierce beneath the rising tide of anger. "You don't have to carry this by yourself." Before she could answer, a familiar voice called her name from across the lot, firm and direct, pulling her attention toward its source. Coach Ramirez was crossing the pavement toward her with long, purposeful strides, his jacket tucked under one arm, his expression carved from quiet determination, though she could see the flicker of concern alive in his eyes. "I have to go," Aaliyah told her brother, her voice softer now, though the weight of their conversation still burned beneath her skin. "We'll talk at home." She ended the call and turned to meet her coach, who stopped a few steps away, studying her face with the wary eye of someone who had seen too many good fighters bruised by battles they never should have had to fight. "I just heard," he said without preamble, his tone clipped but not cold, the words rushing past the surface and straight to the truth. "They didn't waste any time, did they?" "They suspended me," Aaliyah replied, her voice stripped of surprise, worn smooth by the harsh grind of disappointment. Coach Ramirez exhaled slowly, the muscles in his jaw tightening before he spoke. "I expected they'd try something," he admitted, running a hand over the back of his neck. "But not this fast. Not this shameless. They want this to go away," Aaliyah said, her tone flat, her gaze hardening beneath the weight of understanding. "They think if they punish me first, it'll make people stop asking questions. They're scared," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice as though speaking the truth aloud might draw the walls in tighter. "That's why they're moving fast. Fear makes people desperate. It still feels like losing," she confessed, not to seek comfort, but to speak the bitter truth aloud, to let it exist in the open rather than let it fester in silence. Coach Ramirez's eyes sharpened, his jaw setting with quiet resolve. "You didn't lose," he answered firmly. "They're scrambling because they know they lost control, and they're hoping you'll give up before the truth catches up to them." Aaliyah held his gaze for a long moment, letting his words settle against the heavy stone of her frustration, not lifting it entirely, but giving her the strength to hold it a little higher. "I won't let them bury me," she said, her voice clear, each word steady as stone. Coach Ramirez nodded once, slow and certain. "Good," he replied, the simple word carrying the weight of promise, "because this is just the beginning." The day crept forward beneath a sky that seemed to sag under the weight of its own gray clouds, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered, as though nature itself held its breath in step, with the tension rippling through the town. By the time Aaliyah had returned home, the first ripples of the scandal had already begun to reach beyond the sterile walls of the school office, slipping into conversations whispered too loudly in hallways, spreading through hurried text messages and hastily typed social media posts, each one shaping the narrative with reckless hands. It started with a photo, a blurry, poorly framed snapshot of Aaliyah standing tall in the aisle of the bus, her eyes locked on Jake with unwavering fire. The scene caught mid-moment, frozen as proof of a truth far more complicated than the captions that followed it. "Girl goes berserk on bus," read one post, the words thick with deliberate malice, and from there the wildfire spread, fed by people too eager for drama to pause and ask what had really happened. Inside the living room, Aaliyah sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her phone lying face up on the coffee table where it buzzed with relentless notifications, a steady, unwelcome reminder that their lies had taken flight, free from the bounds of truth or decency. Across from her, Deshaun paced like a storm caged in human form, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides as he read the latest updates with growing disgust. "They're spinning it faster than we can catch it," he said. The words pushed through gritted teeth, his eyes dark with fury. "Jake's father's already making calls, you know that? He's got friends on the school board, friends at the district office. They're not even waiting for the so-called investigation. They're making you the villain before anyone can hear your side. They always plan to," Aaliyah answered, her voice quieter but no less certain, her gaze steady on the screen as another flood of comments rolled in, some drenched in ignorant mockery, others in cruel satisfaction, all of them fuel for the fire she could feel tightening around her. "The truth doesn't matter to them. Not if they can bury it beneath enough noise." Her brother stopped pacing long enough to meet her eyes, his expression carved from frustration but anchored by a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "Then we make them hear it anyway," he declared, his voice roughened by determination. "We make them see you, not the story they've twisted to fit their comfort." Before she could answer, a sharp knock rattled the front door, drawing both their eyes in silent question. Deshaun moved first, crossing the room with careful steps, and when he opened the door, he found Coach Ramirez standing on the porch, his face shadowed by concern, but marked by a quiet urgency that pushed past the usual lines of propriety. "I figured you'd be home by now," Coach said, his gaze sweeping past Deshawn to settle on Aaliyah. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of her phone lighting up with yet another toxic message. "It's already everywhere," he said grimly, as much to himself as to them. "They're faster than we thought," Deshawn replied, closing the door behind him, his voice tight with restrained anger. "They've got their story and they're sticking to it." Coach Ramirez let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair as he crossed the room to stand near the coffee table, staring down at the screen as though willing the tide of poison to recede. "Maybe," he said, his tone low but carrying a spark beneath it. "But they made a mistake. In their rush to paint you as the villain, they got careless." Aaliyah lifted her eyes to meet his, a thread of cautious curiosity weaving through the steel of her resolve. "What mistake?" "They forgot about the cameras," Coach answered, his voice hardening, his eyes alive with quiet fire. "The district installed them on every bus after last year's vandalism spree. The footage is supposed to upload automatically to the transportation office's server." Deshawn's eyes widened with a flash of hope, his fists clenching tighter. "You're sure about that?" Coach Ramirez gave a single, sharp nod. "I checked. It's there. And I've already spoken with someone I trust in the office. They're going to pull the footage before anyone can bury it." For the first time since the suspension had been handed down, something within Aaliyah loosened. Not relief, not yet, but a sliver of light pressing through the cracks of the storm. "If that video sees the light of day," she said slowly, "they won't be able to hide behind their lies." "They'll try," Coach warned, his eyes narrowing, his mouth set in a grim line. "Jake's father will throw everything he has at keeping it quiet, but if we move fast, we can get ahead of them." Deshawn's voice rose with sharpened determination. "Then we don't wait," he said. "We push it out ourselves. We get it into the right hands." Aaliyah's gaze held steady on the two men standing before her, her voice firm as she spoke, every word carrying the weight of her resolve. "Then let's finish what they started." Outside, the wind stirred against the window, rattling the glass as though the world itself felt the shift in momentum. The fire they had tried so hard to contain was no longer theirs to control, and Aaliyah, standing in the heart of it, knew that no matter how hard they pushed to silence her, she had already become too loud for them to ignore. The wind pressed harder against the house that evening, as if the whole world beyond the walls had taken notice of the shift unfolding within, the momentum creeping away from those who had so confidently shaped the story into their lie, now slipping quietly but inexorably toward the truth that refused to stay buried. Inside, the light from the living room lamp threw long shadows across the walls, casting an amber glow over the worn pages of school handbooks and district policy documents spread open across the table, the edges creased and marked by the hands that had spent hours poring over them in search of something solid to hold on to. Aaliyah sat at the table, her posture straight, despite the exhaustion threading through her limbs, her eyes fixed not on the storm of opinions flooding her phone, but on the quiet flicker of hope Coach Ramirez had placed in front of her only hours earlier. Deshawn stood near the window, phone to his ear, his voice low but edged with intensity, as he worked through his growing network of calls, every conversation a step closer to dragging the truth into the light. "They're trying to stall," he said after a beat, snapping his phone shut with a sharp flick of his wrist before turning to face them both. "The transportation office knows the footage exists, but they're getting pressure from the district not to release it, not without clearance from higher up." Coach Ramirez shook his head slowly, frustration tightening the lines around his mouth. "Of course they are," he muttered, pacing a short line back and forth across the living room rug, his mind clearly running ahead to the battles waiting just beyond reach. Jake's father must be pulling every string he's got. He knows if that video goes public, they lose their shield. Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. Then we cut the strings before they can tighten, she said, her voice calm, carrying no panic. Only resolve layered thick beneath every word. Before anyone could answer, another vibration buzzed across the table, and Deshawn snatched up his phone, answering on the first ring. "Yeah," he snapped, listening intently, his brow furrowing deeper as the voice on the other end spoke fast and low. He paced as he listened, his steps sharp against the hardwood floor, until finally he stopped, and a slow, grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He ended the call and looked straight at us, his voice steady. "We've got it," he said simply. But the weight behind those 3 words filled the room like thunder rolling low over the hills. Someone inside the office leaked a copy before they could lock it down. Coach Ramirez's eyes lit with a fire that had been waiting for this spark. "How fast can we move?" he asked, already reaching for his jacket, his mind leaping forward, pulling plans into place. "Fast," Deshawn answered, his voice gaining momentum with every breath. "I've got people ready to push it out on every platform. Once it's out, they won't be able to stop it." Aaliyah stood slowly from her seat, the weight that had sat heavy on her chest shifting at last, not vanishing, but changing, becoming something sharper, something that felt less like a burden and more like a blade honed by fire. "Then let them see me," she said, her voice smooth, each syllable deliberate. "Let them see exactly who they tried to silence." The hours that followed moved with a strange tension, time stretching and folding in on itself as the video slipped free of the shadows and into the hungry glare of the public eye. What had been a carefully crafted lie began to fray at the edges as people watched frame by frame, their assumptions eroded by the harsh clarity of truth caught on camera. There, in undeniable footage, was Jake lunging from his seat, Trevor grabbing for Aaliyah's backpack strap, Kyle pushing into the fray with blind aggression, every action laid bare for anyone with eyes to see. The reaction came fast, faster than even Coach Ramirez had anticipated. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, social media was alight with fury, voices rising in collective outrage as the truth spread wider than Jake's father could ever hope to contain. "Did you see this?" Deshawn said, holding out his phone to Aaliyah as the comment threads filled with support. "They're calling for a full investigation. People are demanding the district step in." Aaliyah took the phone, her eyes scanning the flood of messages pouring in from strangers who, only a day before, had been content to scroll past the headlines without a second glance. Now they stood with her, their words sharp and unflinching, cutting through the noise of Jake's well-oiled campaign of deceit. Coach Ramirez exhaled slowly, watching the shifting tide with cautious optimism. "It's not over yet," he warned, though there was a flicker of pride in his gaze. "They'll fight back harder now. Desperate men always do." "Let them," Aaliyah replied, her voice carrying a quiet strength that had only deepened beneath the weight of the last few days. "I'm not backing down." As the night deepened, so too did the resolve filling the room, the once fraying threads of hope now weaving into something far stronger, something no lie could tear apart. Outside the house, the wind rattled against the glass, as though the storm itself had recognized that, for the first time, the battle had begun to turn, and Aaliyah, standing at the heart of it, no longer felt the weight of isolation pressing against her shoulders. She felt the momentum of a truth that could not be silenced, no matter how fiercely they tried. By morning, the quiet murmurs that had rippled beneath the surface had grown into a steady roar, a rising tide that no amount of hurried press releases or closed-door meetings could hope to contain. The footage had carved through the lies like a blade through dry canvas, leaving behind nothing but the raw, undeniable truth, exposed and pulsing for all the world to see. And the world, once content to glance away, was no longer willing to be silent. At the kitchen table, the morning light stretched thin across a sea of open devices, screens filled with headlines that shifted by the minute. Footage contradicts school narrative in bus assault incident. Student speaks out. I watched them corner her. Pressure mounts on district as community demands accountability. Every update pushed against the walls of the house like waves battering the shore, relentless and growing stronger with each passing moment. Deshaun stood over the counter, phone pressed to his ear. His free hand braced against the edge of the counter as he spoke fast and low to yet another local activist who had joined the chorus demanding justice. His voice, though tight with urgency, carried the hard edge of someone who knew he had found solid ground beneath his feet at last, and he refused to let anyone pull it away from him. No, they're still stalling, he said, his eyes scanning the latest flurry of messages flashing across the screen. They're claiming protocol, claiming they need more time to review. But the footage is out. Everyone's seen it now. Time's up. Across the room, Coach Ramirez had set up camp near the living room window, his laptop balanced across his knees as he fired off emails, statements, and calls for action. His normally calm demeanor sharpened into something fierce and unyielding. He paused only long enough to glance toward Aaliyah, who sat between them at the table, her eyes steady on the screen before her, watching as message after message poured in from people she had never met, yet who had chosen to stand with her nonetheless. "They're calling for a board meeting," Coach announced, his voice cutting through the rising hum of notifications. "Community pressure's too strong now. They can't ignore it any longer. We've got them cornered." Aaliyah's gaze lifted from the screen, her voice even, deliberate. "When?" "End of the week," he answered, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Sooner than they'd like, but later than they should. They're hoping the noise dies down before then." "It won't," Deshaun said firmly, ending his call and slipping his phone into his pocket, his eyes burning with conviction. "Not with what's coming?" As if summoned by his words, the doorbell rang sharp and sudden, breaking through the moment like a shot fired into the sky. Coach Ramirez moved first, his instincts honed by years of guiding young athletes through storms of pressure and expectation. He opened the door to find a small group of familiar faces standing on the porch, neighbors and parents from the community, men and women whose expressions carried the weight of anger forged by injustice, and the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "We came to see how we can help," said Mrs. Green, a teacher from the middle school down the road, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as though holding her resolve in place. "The board won't be able to hide behind closed doors once they see us packed into that meeting hall. And there'll be more of us," added Mr. Owens, a local pastor whose voice, deep and sure, seemed to settle over the room like a steadying hand. Words spread far beyond the neighborhood. "People are coming from across the city." Aaliyah stood, not rushing, not forced, but with a quiet strength that felt heavier now, with the weight of the support gathering behind her. She met their eyes without hesitation, her voice calm and clear. "They tried to make me invisible," she said, her words smooth and certain, every syllable filled with quiet fire. "But they only made me impossible to ignore." The room seemed to breathe in her words, and for a moment, the pressure that had weighed so heavily on her chest felt lighter, not gone, but shared across the shoulders of those who had chosen to stand with her, no longer hers to carry alone. "They're scared," Deshaun said, a quiet satisfaction in his tone, though it was not triumph but the recognition of a turning tide. "That's why they're running to their lawyers, hiding behind empty statements. They know they can't silence this." Coach Ramirez nodded, folding his arms across his chest as his gaze swept the room, seeing not just the people gathered, but the momentum swelling beyond these walls. "Let them be scared," he said simply, "because we're not backing down." The day moved forward, each hour tightening the noose around the false narrative Jake's family had so carefully constructed. Statements from students who had been silent out of fear began to surface, their accounts matching the truth caught on camera, their voices joining the growing chorus demanding justice. Even local news crews, slow at first to catch on, arrived at the school gates, their cameras turning toward the administration that could no longer pretend this was a matter best kept in quiet rooms behind closed doors. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Aaliyah stood by the window, her gaze steady on the gathering storm clouds outside, not with fear, but with the certainty of someone who understood that the storm was no longer a threat to her. It was her ally, her weapon, the force that would finally blow away the lies that had tried so hard to bury her. And she would meet it, head on. The sky hung heavy over the town on the day of the board meeting, thick with clouds that seemed to press lower with every passing hour, as though even the weather could not ignore the weight of what was about to unfold. Outside the district offices, a crowd had already gathered long before the meeting was set to begin. Voices weaving together in a low, steady hum of conversation, punctuated by sharp bursts of indignation and firm declarations of support. Handmade signs bobbed above the heads of the crowd, some scrawled in hurried marker, others painted with care, each carrying words that cut through the fog of bureaucratic silence, like spears of light. Justice for Aaliyah. We will not be silenced. Release the footage. We've seen the truth. From her place inside the building, standing at the window of the waiting room, Aaliyah watched the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. Her arms folded across her chest, her breath steady despite the tension that coiled in the air like a drawn bowstring. She had not asked for this army, had not begged for their banners or their voices, yet they had come, drawn not by pity, but by the sharp clarity of truth laid bare. And now, as they stood beneath the darkening sky, they carried not just her fight, but their own, all of them woven together in a cause that had become far greater than the injustice of one day on one bus. They're not backing down, Deshawn said, standing at her side, his gaze locked on the growing crowd. They're louder than they were this morning. They're only going to get louder, Coach Ramirez added, his tone even but edged with the fire of conviction, his eyes not on the crowd, but on the closed double doors that led into the boardroom, behind which the decision-makers paced in quiet panic. The district thought this would blow over before today, but they underestimated what happens when people stop being afraid. Aaliyah let her gaze linger on the faces in the crowd, on the students holding signs alongside teachers, on parents gripping the hands of their children, their mouths set in grim lines of resolve. She saw in them not just supporters, but witnesses, people who had chosen to see her not through the lens of Jake's lies, but through the truth of her strength. They're going to hear us, she said quietly, her words not a question, not a wish, but a certainty carved from every battle she had endured to stand here now. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, sharp and hurried, and a woman in a fitted blazer with the district's crest pinned to her lapel appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with forced politeness that failed to hide the anxiety beneath. "They're ready for you," she announced, her voice carrying the brittle edge of someone well aware that the ground beneath her feet had begun to crack. Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She stepped away from the window with steady strides, her brother and Coach Ramirez flanking her without a word. And as they crossed the corridor toward the boardroom, she felt the weight of the crowd's gaze follow her through the glass, their silent support tightening her spine with quiet resolve. The boardroom was larger than she expected, wide and sterile beneath the fluorescent lights, the walls lined with framed photographs of past administrators, their smiles frozen in time, their eyes blind to the storm now filling the space. At the long table at the front of the room sat the board members, their faces set in varying degrees of discomfort and defensiveness, as though they had come prepared for a skirmish, but found themselves facing a reckoning instead. Jake's father sat among them, his posture stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line of suppressed fury, and beside him, the superintendent shifted papers with a nervous energy that betrayed the weakness behind their polished facade. As Aaliyah entered, the room quieted, all conversation falling away, like dust swept from the air. She moved with deliberate calm, never hurrying, never faltering, and when she reached the center of the room, she raised her eyes to meet the board directly, her voice carrying not fear, but strength sharpened by truth. "You've seen the footage," she began, her words smooth and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "You've heard the witnesses who finally found the courage to speak. There is no question left about what happened." Across the table, the board president cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Miss Monroe," he started, his tone practiced but thin beneath the weight of the moment. "While the footage does provide context, this board must also consider the perspectives of all students involved. The perspective of liars?" Deshawn's voice cut in before the man could finish, firm and scathing, his eyes locked on the superintendent. "You mean the boys who attacked my sister and then cried victim the moment they lost control?" A ripple moved through the audience gathered behind them, a quiet surge of agreement that pressed against the backs of the board members like a tide rising too fast to outrun. Coach Ramirez stepped forward, his words sharp and precise. "You've had every opportunity to do the right thing," he said, his gaze sweeping across the table. "And now the truth is no longer just in this room. It's in every home, on every screen, in every conversation in this town." Aaliyah let the silence that followed settle heavy in the room, then spoke once more, her voice steady as stone. "The question is not whether you've seen the truth," she said. "The question is whether you have the courage to act on it." For a moment, no one spoke, the board frozen beneath the weight of her challenge, the crowd beyond the walls a constant, growing presence pressing against their silence. And outside, as if echoing her words, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. The sound a steady reminder that the storm, at last, had arrived. The rain gathered strength against the windows as the board members shifted in their seats, their polished expressions beginning to crack beneath the mounting pressure that filled the room like rising water with no place left to drain. Outside, the storm had fully claimed the sky. Sheets of water driving down against the crowd still gathered in defiance of the weather, their signs slick with rain but held high without wavering, their voices rising even louder beneath the steel-gray clouds. Inside, the air had thickened with tension, so palpable it seemed to cling to the skin, seeping into every breath drawn by those seated around the long, lacquered table. Aaliyah stood at the center of it all, unmoving, her shoulders squared beneath the weight of not just her own fight, but the fury and resolve of the many who had come to stand with her, visible or otherwise. The board president cleared his throat for the second time, but no amount of nervous clearing could scrape away the reality pressing against his lungs. His eyes flitted toward Jake's father, seeking refuge in the familiar influence that had guided the district for years. Yet even that once reliable fortress showed its cracks now. Jake's father sitting rigid in his chair, his mouth pressed into a bloodless line, his eyes burning with the quiet fury of a man who had lost control and knew it. His eyes flitted toward Jake's father, seeking refuge in the familiar influence that had guided the district for years. Yet even that once reliable fortress showed its cracks now. Jake's father sitting rigid in his chair, his mouth pressed into a bloodless line, his eyes burning with the quiet fury of a man who had lost control and knew it. "We will, of course," the president began, his voice tight and too carefully measured, "take all perspectives into consideration before issuing a final decision." A scoff rippled from the crowd, low but unmistakable, a sound that felt like the early crack of thunder beneath the rising storm. Aaliyah let the moment hang, not rushing to fill it, her silence speaking louder than any argument as she fixed her gaze squarely on the row of decision-makers who squirmed beneath it. But Deshawn stepped forward, his voice cutting into the quiet with the steady power of a tide that refused to turn back. "Your final decision," he said firmly, "was made the moment you chose to believe their lies over the truth you had in your own hands." He gestured toward the tablet, that now lay on the table before the board. The paused frame of the bus footage frozen in clear evidence of everything they had tried so desperately to bury. Jake's outstretched hand, Trevor's grasp on the backpack strap, Aaliyah's defensive stance. It was all there. Irrefutable. Undeniable. Coach Ramirez's voice followed, layered with sharp precision, every word chosen like a carefully aimed arrow. "What you're hoping for," he said, looking not just at the president, but at every face seated at the table, "is for this to fade, for the noise to die down, so you can slip quietly back to your comfort. But let me be clear, this won't fade. Not today. Not tomorrow." A murmur of agreement swelled from the crowd gathered in the hallway just outside the doors, voices of parents and students alike rising in unity. "We saw the truth," someone called out. No more silence. The board members exchanged hurried glances, the edges of their authority fraying with every passing second. Jake's father, struggling to reclaim the moment, leaned forward at last, his voice sharp and brittle beneath the weight of desperation. "This is a disruption," he snapped, his tone aimed more at the crowd than at Aaliyah herself. "You're all allowing one incident to derail the focus of our schools." Aaliyah's reply came without hesitation, her voice strong, clear, and unwavering as she spoke not only to the man across from her, but to every single person in the room and beyond its walls. "This was never just one incident," she said, her words smooth as the rain sliding down the windows, yet hard as the steel beneath it. "This is about every day you let them torment me. Every day you looked away because it was easier than standing up for what was right." Her gaze swept across the board, pinning each of them beneath the full weight of her truth. "You taught them that I was invisible," she continued, her voice rising not in anger, but in strength, steady and controlled. "And now, you're learning I'm not." The room held its breath beneath the force of her words, and for a heartbeat, even the rain seemed to quiet, as though the storm itself was listening. Across the table, the superintendent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his carefully rehearsed neutrality slipping away beneath the undeniable clarity of the moment. "Miss Monroe," he began, his voice thinner than before, "we, the board, understand the gravity of this situation. We are reviewing." "You've had your review," Deshawn interrupted, his tone low but unyielding. "The footage is out. The witnesses have spoken. The only thing left to decide is whether you choose to stand with the truth or bury yourselves under the lie." The board president faltered beneath the glare of public scrutiny, his eyes flickering once more to Jake's father, only to find no rescue waiting for him there. Even the man who had once pulled strings from behind velvet curtains seemed to recognize the inevitable collapse, his mouth tightening as he looked away, leaving the board stranded in the wreckage of their failed cover-up. Then, from the back of the room, a voice rose, clear and defiant. It belonged to Mrs. Green, the teacher who had marched alongside the community to fill these chambers. "Enough delays," she called out. "The whole town's watching. Make your decision." The board members shifted, glances flying like nervous birds trapped in a cage, and Aaliyah stood at the center of it all, unmoved, steady as stone beneath the gaze of the entire town. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with certainty, her hands resting at her sides, open, strong, ready. They had tried to silence her. They had tried to bury her beneath their lies, and now, with no place left to run, they would have to face her fully in the light. The pause inside the boardroom stretched longer than anyone dared to breathe, a silence so taut it felt as though even the storm battering the windows had paused to listen for what would come next. The air was heavy with the weight of expectation, not only from the packed room, but from the hundreds beyond its walls, from the voices that had risen too loud to be ignored, from the truth that had been wrestled out of shadows and laid bare beneath the unflinching glare of public reckoning. Aaliyah stood motionless at the center of the room, her presence steady and unyielding, as though she were the axis around which the entire chamber now turned. She could feel the eyes of the crowd behind her, not pulling her down, but holding her upright, a silent wall of resolve bracing her against the trembling facade of authority seated before her. The board president shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat once more, though the sound seemed small, almost pitiful, beneath the thunder of the storm outside and the even greater thunder of the people's will pressing against the walls of the room. His gaze flicked to the superintendent, who gave a shallow nod, a silent admission that there was no further ground left to retreat upon. "Miss Monroe," the president began, his voice thinner than parchment, every word carefully chosen as though he still believed they might thread a safe path through the wreckage of their crumbling authority. "The board has reviewed the evidence presented, including the security footage and the additional statements from students and staff. It is clear," he paused, his throat tightening, "that the initial conclusions drawn by this administration were in error." A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet at first, but swelling as hope reignited within those who had stood by Aaliyah, their support no longer a fragile flame, but a roaring fire too powerful to be smothered. Aaliyah held the president's gaze without blinking, her voice calm, unwavering, a quiet storm behind her words. "Say it plainly," she told him, her words smooth, deliberate, no trace of anger clouding her tone, only the clear demand for honesty laid bare. "The truth deserves to be heard, without your fear dressing it up." The president faltered, his lips parting soundlessly for a breath, before he straightened his spine as though the weight of inevitability had finally pinned him in place. "You acted in self-defense," he admitted, each word heavy as it dropped into the room. "The suspension is hereby rescinded, effective immediately. Furthermore, an official apology will be issued from this board to you and your family." Applause burst from the crowd, loud and sudden, raw with relief and righteous triumph. Parents stood from their seats. Students raised their voices in cheers that echoed off the walls, and even among the more cautious staff members, a few clapped with careful but unmistakable approval. Outside, the storm lashed harder against the windows, but inside the chamber, the atmosphere had shifted entirely, no longer suffocating but alive with the victory that had, for too long, seemed just beyond reach. Yet amidst the noise, Jake's father surged to his feet, his face twisted in a storm of fury, his voice rising sharp and brittle against the swell of celebration. "You can't do this," he barked, slamming a palm flat against the table as though brute force alone might turn back the tide. "This board is making a mockery of justice. You're bowing to pressure from the mob." His words, once capable of swaying rooms with the mere force of his influence, now sounded hollow, desperate against the weight of undeniable truth. He looked to the superintendent for support, then to the other board members, but found only avoidance in their eyes, the realization settling over him like a collapse from within. Coach Ramirez stepped forward, his voice clear, ringing out over the fading clamor. "The only mockery here is the one you built when you thought your name could bury the truth," he said, every word sharp and precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "That ends today." Deshawn's voice followed, fierce and certain. "You tried to silence my sister," he said, locking eyes with Jake's father, "but you only made her voice louder." Aaliyah let their words settle into the room, then stepped forward herself, her gaze steady, her voice as steady and powerful as the storm outside. "You thought you could make an example out of me," she said, her eyes never leaving the man who had thought his power untouchable. "But the only example you made is of yourselves, and it's a lesson this town won't forget." Jake, seated beside his father, sank lower in his chair, his face pale beneath the flush of shame, his bravado crushed beneath the weight of exposure. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, the realization of his downfall settling cold and final across his expression. The board president, as though sensing there was nothing left to salvage, turned to Aaliyah once more, offering a shallow nod. "This board recognizes its failure," he said, the words dragged from him by the force of undeniable truth, "and we will answer for it." Aaliyah did not respond with words. She stood tall, her chin high, her eyes clear, her silence louder than any closing argument, as the boardroom door swung open and the gathered crowd poured inside, their presence filling every corner of the space with the undeniable force of justice fulfilled. For the first time, she felt the storm not as a threat pressing down upon her, but as the wind at her back, lifting her forward, carrying her not away from the fight, but straight through its heart. She had won, and they had lost. The storm that had raged so fiercely through the night broke apart by morning, leaving the streets damp beneath a clearing sky, the clouds retreating to the edges of the horizon as if making way for something new, something hard-earned and unclouded at last. At the school gates, there was no mistaking the change in the air, no denying the shift that had settled across the campus, like the first clean breath after a heavy downpour. The same students who had once averted their eyes in uncomfortable silence now moved through the hallways with a different kind of energy, not loud or chaotic, but humming beneath the surface, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had witnessed a reckoning, and they knew who had stood at its center. Aaliyah walked the length of the hallway with steady steps, not needing to rush, not needing to glance over her shoulder, because for the first time, the weight of eyes following her was no longer the burden of suspicion, but the quiet current of respect. Where there had once been whispers of mockery, there was now the low murmur of recognition, students nodding in quiet acknowledgement as she passed, teachers pausing mid-conversation to offer brief but genuine glances that carried more meaning than words. Jake was nowhere to be seen. In the days following the board's decision, the collapse of his carefully constructed image had been swift and brutal, not by force, but by the undeniable tide of truth that no amount of bluster could hold back. The messages that had once filled group chats with smug jokes about Aaliyah's supposed defeat had turned sharp and cold, his name slipping from conversations like an unwelcome weight. The friends who had laughed alongside him now kept their distance, the bravado that had fed his cruelty stripped away, leaving only the hollow shadow of the boy who had once ruled over their fear. Trevor and Kyle fared no better. Whispers trailed behind them like storm clouds that refused to drift away. Classmates turning their backs in quiet rejection, their reputations crumbling under the slow erosion of disdain. Kyle, unable to stomach the daily reminders of his cowardice, had quietly withdrawn from school altogether, his name removed from the roster with none daring to ask where he had gone. Trevor lingered longer, stubborn beneath the weight of disgrace, but even his forced swagger had faltered beneath the relentless pull of isolation, his former allies stepping away as though afraid the stain of failure might cling to them too. Even in the spaces where they had once felt untouchable, they found only empty echoes. No seats saved at the lunch tables, no cheers at games, no hushed admiration trailing their steps. They had become shadows in the very hallways they used to command, their downfall not delivered by fists or fury, but by the quiet, unyielding force of a community that had seen their ugliness fully exposed and refused to look away. For Jake, the fall had been even more complete. His father's influence, once a shield against accountability, had buckled under the weight of public outrage. School board meetings now overflowed with voices demanding broader reforms, parents who had once stayed silent stepping forward to question the decisions made behind closed doors, their patience with old power structures burned away by the fire Aaliyah had sparked. Rumors circled that the family had begun making plans to leave town entirely. Whispers of a fresh start somewhere far from the ruins of their reputation, though no amount of distance could outrun the truth that had followed them. Coach Ramirez met Aaliyah at the edge of the courtyard, his arms folded across his chest, a quiet pride alive in his expression as he watched the subtle shifts unfolding all around them. "It's not just about you anymore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "You turned a moment into a movement." Aaliyah's gaze swept over the courtyard, over the students whose eyes now met hers without hesitation, whose respect was not given out of fear but earned recognition. "It never was only about me," she answered, her voice smooth, steady, and clear beneath the brightening sky. They just didn't see it until now. Deshaun joined them, his steps easy, his expression relaxed, in a way that had been rare in the tense days leading up to the confrontation. He looked around the campus with a quiet satisfaction, then turned his attention to his sister, his eyes warm but serious beneath the calm. "They'll remember this," he said. No need to explain who he meant. Even the ones who try to pretend they weren't part of it. They'll carry it with them. Aaliyah gave a small nod, her breath deep, and even as she let the weight of victory settle fully into her chest. "Good," she replied, her voice holding no bitterness, only the quiet strength of someone who had stood at the center of the storm and refused to fall. They should. The school day moved forward, not erased of its usual rhythms, but forever changed beneath the surface. Every conversation, every glance shaped by the echoes of what had unfolded in the bright light of truth. Aaliyah walked with purpose, not as someone basking in triumph, but as someone who understood that victory was not the end, but the beginning of something far larger than herself. She had not sought the spotlight, had not craved the weight of leading others, yet she had earned both through the simple, powerful act of refusing to be broken. And now, as she stepped forward into the days ahead, she carried not only her own strength, but the strength of those who had once been too afraid to speak, now emboldened by the fire she had sparked. Beyond the gates, the world stretched open before her, no longer a narrow path hemmed in by fear and prejudice, but a wide, unbroken horizon, waiting. And Aaliyah, with the storm at her back and the future in her steady hands, was ready to walk it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.